Hello, friends. This is Confessions with Amy, and I'm glad you're visiting my channel. Here we share new confessions every day.
I was eating pistachio gelato on the steps of an old basilica in Verona when the call came through. I almost didn't pick up. The number flashed Steve Callahan, but I hadn't saved it as Dad in years. He wasn't my real father, just my mother's second husband, the kind of man who smiled too wide and shook hands like he wanted to break bones. "Hello," I said casually, licking the gelato before it melted onto my fingers. His voice was stiff, clipped. Businesslike, like always. "Delaney, just wanted to inform you. The trust has been transferred. Officially. Caleb is the beneficiary now." I let a pause hang between us, a silence so sharp you could cut through marble with it. Then I said it. One word. "Okay." I could practically hear the confusion on the other end. Steve had always expected me to break, or at least beg. That was his game. Manipulate, control, reward obedience. And if you didn't play along, you were cut off, or worse, replaced. In my case, replaced by his own son Caleb, the golden child, the carefully sculpted heir, the All-American quarterback who went to SMU and came home for summers with a Rolex and a God complex. "Okay?" Steve finally asked, as if he didn't quite trust his own ears. "Yeah," I said. "Thanks for the update." I ended the call before he could say anything else. I let the phone sit in my hand for a moment. My gelato had started to drip. A part of me wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to scream. But mostly I just felt calm. Like I'd been watching a storm roll in from miles away, and now that it had finally hit, I could close the shutters and sleep. Because here's the thing Steve never understood. I'm not the same girl who lived under his roof. I'm not the obedient little chess piece he could move when it suited him. I'm a lawyer. And 2 years ago, I rewrote the board. When I turned 21, I started going through the trust documents myself. Not just reading them, dissecting them. My mom had left me the trust in full, no contingencies. But Steve was the trustee. That had been her one mistake, trusting him. But I found something. A loophole. With the right legal strategy, I could restructure the trust, reassign control to a neutral fiduciary. Quietly. Legally. Irrevocably. I hired a private firm in Chicago under a shell LLC. Used a personal friend of my mother's as a silent trustee. Changed the language. Moved the assets. Separated every possible tie. Steve didn't even notice. Because I let him think he still had control. What he transferred today was nothing but a hollow shell. An empty fund. No assets. No legal value. Just a title and some paper. Caleb got nothing. And I walked away with everything. Quietly, invisibly, untouchably. I stood up and walked through a narrow stone alley, the kind that feels like a secret. My best friend, Mara, was waiting at the cafe across the piazza. She was sipping espresso and sketching something in her notebook. Probably another tattoo design for a stranger she met on the train. She looked up and smiled. "That your stepdad?" "Yeah," I said, sliding into the chair across from her. He handed the trust to Caleb. Her eyebrows shot up. "Wait, the trust?" "The trust." "Yep. And you're just fine?" I took a sip of her espresso and smirked. "More than fine." She stared at me for a long second. "You planned this." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She leaned back in her chair, let out a low whistle and said, "Damn, Delaney. Remind me never to get on your bad side." I was 16 the first time I realized Steve Callahan wanted me out of the picture. It wasn't anything dramatic. Not a screaming match, not a threat. It was subtle, a shift in temperature. Like when the sun disappears behind a cloud, and the air goes cold without warning. I had come downstairs wearing my mom's old scarf. A silk one from Paris, the kind she only wore on good days. I'd found it in a cedar box the night before and had this stupid teenage hope that if I wore it, maybe I'd feel closer to her. Like I could still be her daughter. Still have a mother, even if only in a memory. Steve saw it and said, too casually, "That doesn't belong to you." I looked up from the cereal bowl. It was Mom's. He took a sip of his coffee and replied, "It was your mother's. Now it's part of the estate." I remember how dry my throat felt after that. I didn't say anything. just took off the scarf and folded it on the counter. He didn't thank me. He just walked out of the room. A week later, the scarf was gone. So was the box. Things changed fast after that. Steve married my mother when I was 14. At first, he pretended to be this gentle, steadying presence. He wore tailored suits and called me kiddo, and told everyone how blessed he felt to be part of our family. My mom had been diagnosed a year before, stage 4. We all knew how the story would end, but we tried to act like it wouldn't. When she died, he buried her in a marble tomb and had a quote from Rainer Maria Rilke etched into the stone. I remember standing there in black, watching the letters being carved and wondering who Rilke even was. I wanted to believe he cared, but it didn't take long for his mask to slip. By 17, I barely recognized the house I lived in. My room had been moved to the smaller guest suite. My school tuition started getting delayed unless I smiled at the dinner table. And then came Caleb, Steve's son, from a previous marriage. He moved in that summer like he was always meant to be there. Blonde, loud, charming in that frat boy way people mistake for charisma. He was 19, full of confidence and cheap cologne, and within weeks he'd taken over everything. The bigger bedroom, the garage, even the guest house that used to be my mother's studio. Steve lit up around him. With Caleb, he laughed more. Drank scotch in the evenings. Took weekend trips to Lake George and came back with sunburn and stories. With me, he was cold, transactional. I became an obligation. One night, I heard them talking in the study. The door was cracked open just enough. "Delaney's going to be a problem," Steve said. "She's just a kid," Caleb shrugged. "She's a kid with a trust worth 7 figures. And she thinks she's entitled to it." There was a silence. Then Caleb said, "What are you gonna do?" Steve didn't answer right away. But that night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time. Looking back, I think that's when it all started. Not the betrayal, that came later, but the shift inside me. That night, I stopped expecting anyone to protect me. I stopped hoping things would return to how they were before. And I started planning. It began with questions. Quiet ones. I asked the estate lawyer, a sweet, semi-retired man named Ronald Hatch, for a copy of the trust. Told him I was just curious. He hesitated at first, but I reminded him I was legally of age to review it. When I read through the documents, I barely understood half of it. But one line stuck with me. The trustee may not reassign the principal to another beneficiary, nor modify disbursement terms without the beneficiary's consent. It meant I had power. Not total control, but a foothold. Something I could work with. And I knew then, if Steve wanted a war, he'd get one. But it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be angry. It would be silent, strategic, and final. The next 2 years were a game of shadows. I played obedient, studied quietly, smiled at holidays, took a part-time job at a local legal clinic just to get my hands on real documents, real case law. Behind the scenes, I was building my own team. Mara introduced me to her cousin in Chicago, a tax attorney with a hacker's brain and no love for corporate families. He connected me with a boutique fiduciary firm that specialized in quiet asset distancing. I created an LLC, opened separate accounts, assigned a neutral fiduciary, reorganized the trust under New York law, ironclad and fully compliant. By the time I was 22, the trap was set. The only thing left to do was wait. And now, it's sprung. Steve thinks he won, that he cut me out, stripped me clean, and gave Caleb the crown. But what he handed his son was a shell, a legal corpse. And the real inheritance? I buried it so deep, neither of them will ever find it. When people talk about revenge, they usually imagine something loud, explosive, headlines, screaming, maybe even blood. That's not how you destroy someone like Steve Callahan. Men like him, men who wear respectability like armor, they crumble under silence, under the weight of not knowing when it all went wrong. And the best part? By the time they notice, it's already over. I was 21 when I pulled the switch. It started with a paper trail, one Steve would never bother to follow. The man thought due diligence was something secretaries did, not something that could dismantle his plans. Through a legal contact in Chicago, I formed an LLC under the name Sequoia Anchor Holdings. It sounded like an investment shell, vague, impersonal. Exactly the kind of thing Steve would ignore. The LLC wasn't fake. It had a tax ID, a registered agent, quarterly filings. On paper, it was a passive real estate firm with minimal activity. Behind that, I used the LLC to retain a private fiduciary, Claire Hartwick, a former estate attorney with a reputation for discretion and claws sharp enough to cut through steel. I never met Claire in person. We spoke once over an encrypted call. Her voice was cool, precise. "You understand this means relinquishing control, yes?" she asked. "I understand," I said. "But if he ever tries to access the assets, he won't be able to. And if he challenges it," she was quiet for a beat. "We bury people like him in paper." I liked her instantly. The technical side of the transfer was the easy part. The real challenge was pretending I was still stupid. At home, I played my role. Polite, passive, grateful for every crumb. When Steve reviewed the trust each quarter, I let him feel in charge. I nodded when he lied about market dips. I even acted surprised when he told me I'd have to tighten up spending. Meanwhile, every real asset, the index funds, the offshore holdings, the commercial real estate portfolio, was moved under Sequoia's protection. Not stolen, not hidden. Moved. Legally. Transparently. But completely out of his reach. He still held the original trust, sure. But the balance was zero. Every clause he quoted applied to a ghost. To make it airtight, I drafted a beneficiary resignation and signed it under a new structure, voluntarily stepping away from the old trust, citing a desire to reorganize assets independently. It sounded naive, almost generous, exactly what a clueless heiress would do. Claire filed it. The IRS approved it. The structure was sealed. And Steve? He never read the new documents. He was too busy teaching Caleb how to golf. By the time I left for Europe with Mara, the transition was 6 months old. I used the trip as cover. Told Steve I was finding myself before applying to law school, which wasn't a total lie. I had applied, got in too, but I deferred a year, just in case things got ugly. They never did. Because when the moment finally came when Steve made his move, I didn't fight him. I let him win. I remember sitting on the train from Venice to Florence, watching cypress trees blur past the window. Mara was asleep across from me, earbuds in, sketchbook open on her lap. That's when the email came through. A scan of the legal notice Steve had filed, formally naming Caleb as successor beneficiary to the trust. No mention of me. No courtesy call. Just a declaration. Delaney Quinn has been removed. I smiled. It was like watching someone rob an empty safe. They thought they'd gotten away with something, but they didn't even know what they missed. Sometimes Mara asks me if I regret not confronting them, not slamming the truth in their faces, not watching Steve's ego collapse in real time. But here's the thing, I don't need to see it. I know men like Steve. Their pride is built on control. Appearances. The illusion that they're the smartest ones in the room. What I took from him wasn't just money. I took away the win. He'll keep waiting for me to call, to cry, to beg. And every silent day that passes, that's my revenge. It started with a phone call I didn't answer. Then another. Then 3 emails. The kind Steve never used to send. Stiff, overly polite, clearly not written by him. His assistant must have drafted them. Subject lines like, clarification regarding trust fund transfer. Request for your signature. Urgent. Disbursement issue. I read them once, then archived every single one. He was spiraling. I could feel it. The thing about men like Steve is they don't panic right away. No, they doubt everyone else first. He probably called Hatch, the estate attorney, and barked down the phone, demanding to know why Caleb hadn't been able to access the investment accounts. I imagine Hatch's answer was quiet, precise, like he was explaining how gravity works. She restructured it, Steve. 18 months ago. You signed the consent forms yourself, remember? Standard clause as trustee. You approved the transfer of assets under fiduciary review. Perfectly legal. Pause. You didn't read them? I didn't see the aftermath. I didn't need to. Steve would have torn through his office, looking for the originals, rifled through safes, drawers, his email archives, trying to find a loophole, a missed detail, a chance to undo what had already been done. But it wasn't there, because I didn't just change the locks. I burned the house down behind me. A few weeks later, Mara and I were in Lisbon, staying in this strange, beautiful apartment with blue-tiled walls and windows that opened onto the smell of sea air and sardines frying in the street. I woke up to a voicemail. Not from Steve. From Caleb. Hey, Delaney. So, this is kind of awkward, but we've been looking into the trust, and I think there's been a mistake. I was told I'd have access by now, but Claire something? She says you're the only authorized contact. So yeah, call me back. He sounded confused and nervous. I played the message again just to hear the hesitation in his voice. I never called him back. 2 days later, Steve emailed me directly. No assistant this time. No fake politeness. Just this. Delaney, I want to remind you that family is a permanent bond, and that what you've done will have consequences. We're willing to discuss a compromise if you're willing to act like an adult. Think carefully. Steve. I stared at the message for a while, letting the words roll around in my head like stones. Family is a permanent bond. That was rich, coming from a man who had erased me from my own inheritance. And now he wanted a compromise? There is no compromise with someone who only values power. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my encrypted folder and sent a brief message to Claire Hartwick. He's starting to realize. Stay the course. No contact. No permissions. DQ. She responded 1 minute later. Understood. He has no legal standing. If he contacts the firm again, we'll redirect through counsel. By the time I returned to the States 2 months later, Steve had stopped trying to reach me. Caleb's Instagram had gone dark. And the Callahan Family Fund, the one Steve bragged about at every dinner party in Ridgewood, had mysteriously vanished from public records. Only people who knew what to look for, the shell names, the dummy holdings, the clean exit trails, would know what really happened. And no one in Steve's world had that kind of eye. He was too proud to admit he'd lost. Too scared to ask how. Too broken to stop pretending. I didn't celebrate. Not outwardly. There was no champagne, no dramatic speech into the mirror, no triumphant piano cue. I just went home. Not to his house, not the cold mausoleum he built with my mother's money. I went to mine. A quiet apartment in Brooklyn. Bookshelves. Sunlight. A modest espresso machine I actually knew how to use. My own name on the deed. Paid in full by a girl everyone thought was naive. And for the first time in years, I slept with the window open and the door unlocked. Because I wasn't running anymore. You don't feel the cut right away. Not when you break ties with people who raised you. Not when you leave the house you grew up in, or block the number of the man who signed your high school checks and called himself your father. No. The pain comes later. Quietly. When you're alone. Like a bruise that doesn't show until morning. After I got back from Europe, I kept my circle tight. Mara was still in Portugal for a residency. I told her everything that had gone down. The legal switch, the fallout, Steve's pathetic final emails. She sent me a voice note that just said, Delaney, you're a goddamn legend. But being a legend doesn't keep you warm at night. I had the money, the independence, the victory, but I also had silence. And silence makes you think. Sometimes I wonder what my mother would have said. I used to have dreams where I told her what I did, how I beat Steve at his own game. And in those dreams, she always looked sad. Not angry, not surprised. Just heartbroken. Not at me, but at the fact that it had to be done. That she left me in the hands of a man who saw me as a liability instead of a daughter. She didn't know, of course. When she married Steve, she thought she was securing our future. She thought she was giving us stability. A second chance. But men like Steve don't raise daughters. They groom threats. I legally dropped Callahan that fall. It wasn't a big process. A courthouse in Queens. A small filing fee. No tears. No ceremony. Just a line through an old name and a signature beneath a new one. Delaney Quinn. That was the name on my mother's first published book. The one she wrote before she ever met Steve. before he edited her out of her own legacy. It felt right, like taking back something that was always mine. I enrolled at Columbia the following spring. Law school. I wasn't the smartest in the room, not yet, but I was the one who knew why I was there. Most people wanted to defend others. I respected that. I wanted to build walls, structures, contracts with no loose ends. I wanted to make sure that no girl like me would ever get ambushed the way I almost did. I specialized in fiduciary law and estate protection. You can guess why. My professors said I had a mind for strategy. They didn't know I'd already run circles around the kind of men who wrote the textbooks. Mara came back that summer. She moved into the brownstone across from mine. We shared coffee in the mornings, gossip in the evenings, and silence whenever we needed it. She never pushed me to talk about Steve or Caleb. Never asked if I missed them. She knew the answer. There's no grief when someone shows you they never loved you. Just clarity. It took time. Almost 2 years. But one day, the ache was gone. The urge to look them up. The curiosity about what they were doing. Whether they still talked about me at those cold, sterile dinner parties. I stopped wondering. And that, more than anything, felt like freedom. It came on a Tuesday. One of those cold, brittle New York mornings where the air feels like glass and the coffee shop windows fog from breath alone. I was halfway through reviewing a case brief on fiduciary abuse when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I don't answer those anymore. Not since Steve. But then came the voicemail. Ms. Quinn, this is Serena Locke. I'm a producer at Atlas Weekly. We're doing a piece on legacy theft and financial coercion within families. I understand you have a unique perspective. We'd love to speak with you, on or off the record. I froze. Not because I was scared, but because part of me had always assumed my story would die in the dark, tucked neatly away behind NDAs and sealed filings. That was the price of victory. Privacy, silence, no witnesses. And yet, here was the world knocking. I didn't call her back at first. I told myself it wasn't worth it. That going public meant opening old wounds, inviting questions, losing control of the narrative. Steve would see it. Caleb too. And they'd spin it the way people like them always do. Call me vindictive, manipulative, ungrateful. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the girls like me, smart but isolated. Too polite to question things. Raised to trust men in suits who spoke in half-truths and balance sheets. I remembered how alone I felt the night I signed my trust into the hands of a stranger with a steadier voice than my own father. And I realized something. Maybe silence wasn't strength anymore. Maybe it was surrender. I met Serena at a wine bar in the village. She was sharp-eyed mid-30s, carried herself like someone who'd seen 1,000 stories but still knew a good one when she found it. She let me speak. I told her everything. The scarf. The coldness. Caleb's sudden arrival. The switch. The trap. The collapse. When I finished, she sat back and said, "You know, you could inspire a lot of people." I laughed. "I'm not interested in being anyone's hero." "You don't have to be," she said. "Just tell the truth." We ran it anonymously at first. She changed my name, blurred the details. But the bones of the story were there. A girl stripped of her inheritance by a stepfather with a taste for control, who turned the game against him. The article went viral in 48 hours. I watched it happen in real time. Inboxes flooding, law professors reposting, forums dissecting the legal mechanics like it was a chess match. I got emails from women in California, Nebraska, even the UK. I didn't know I could fight back. "You just gave me a blueprint. You reminded me I'm not crazy." It was overwhelming. Beautiful. Terrifying. And I knew then I couldn't stay anonymous forever. 2 months later, I walked into Serena's studio and gave her permission to use my name. Delaney Quinn. Daughter. Strategist. Survivor. The piece aired nationally. Steve never issued a statement. But I know he saw it. I know because a week later, Claire forwarded me a cease and desist letter. Amateur, emotional, and completely without legal merit. I told her to frame it. These days, I split my time between 2 offices. One at a boutique legal firm in Soho, the other at a nonprofit that teaches financial self-defense to girls aging out of foster care. I still keep my life quiet. No interviews, no glamour, no memoir, just work. But sometimes when I pass a mirror, I see my mother's eyes looking back at me. Not afraid, not broken, ready. Because I was never the weak one. I was the storm they didn't see coming. And now, I teach others how to build thunder.